Hi there, Paul here. Another English language A-level video, this one on another aspect of language change, namely grammatical change. Now, grammar, as well as all the other language levels, changes over time. The change may not be as dramatic as some other language levels. So, for example, on lexical change, the word Google is invented. People are Googling within 5 minutes. So it seems to happen almost instantaneously. Grammatical change happens, but it may be a bit slower to accrue. Let's look at some public examples of people using English grammar in unusual ways. And when we're talking about grammar, we're really talking about the structures of the language. So we're talking about the syntax, like the word order of the language, or we're looking at the inflections on the back ends of words. Okay, so grammar is about the structures of the language. Here are some car advertisements. So have a look at this one. This is the first one. It says, "Go fun yourself." Second one, "Drive confident." And then thirdly, "Weekend like no one is watching." So pause the video there if I were you and try and think, well, how is grammar being used in a creative way by these organisations? Okay, so let's look at them one by one. Let's go back to "Go fun yourself." So part of the attraction of this is the phonological manipulation, where it's taking that word fun and it sounds like a different taboo word that might be in your mind. So there's a bit of naughtiness involved there. But in terms of the grammar, this is really to do with word classes and functional shifts. Now, functional shift is the idea that you take a word, which is usually one word class, and then you start using it as a different word class. So you need to think about that word fun. Fun is usually an abstract noun, i.e. we had a lot of fun. Sometimes it can be used as an adjective, can't it? We had a fun weekend. Here it's being used neither as a noun or an adjective. It's being used as a verb. Go fun yourself. So that's non-standard. It's a creative use of grammar, and that's one of the reasons why perhaps this advertisement catches your eye. Here's a second car advertisement. "Drive confident," it says, the new Polo. So there's something that might strike you as slightly odd about this word confident. So yes, it's modifying the verb, and therefore a word that modifies a verb is usually an adverb. And if it's an adverb of manner, modifying a verb, it's usually going to end with an ly suffix. Not in this case. So it seems like it's the adjective form that's put next to the verb. So that strikes us as being unusual, and again, it's that creative use of grammar. Now, this one isn't a car one. This is for a hotel, and it says, "Weekend like no one is watching." And again, this is to do with functional shifts, isn't it? So this is this word here, weekend, which is usually a noun, but here seems to be used as a verb, something that you do. In fact, a material verb. Okay. So you might be able to come up with some other examples of current day advertising which uses language in creative ways, and not just any old creative ways, but uses grammar in creative ways. And so that opens the door to debates about, whether institutions and organisations should be doing this. Should they be putting out there into the public domain such blatant uses of non-standard English? Some people might be disturbed about that, and they might say, well, younger people, there they are, they're going to school, they're trying to learn the patterns of standard English, but all around them, that knowledge is being subverted by these organisations who should know better. What do you think about that level of argument? Okay, so if you were in my class, I'd be getting you to be looking at this video, which is called 5 Wrong Grammar Rules Everyone Knows. And if I can just go back to my notes here to explain about those grammar rules that are talked about here. So the first grammar rule that is spoken about on this video is no initial coordinators, which means don't put words like and or so or but at the beginning of a sentence. Okay, you might have been taught that at school. and your primary school teacher probably told you that with the best interests because they didn't want you to be writing in the same way as you're speaking. The problem is that lots and lots of writers, including journalists and great writers of literature, do this. They start sentences with initial coordinators. So it's confusing. That's the first one. Second one is about the overuse of the passive voice. Don't use the passive voice too much. And the point that's made on the video is that too much use of the passive voice makes you sound like you're writing in a police blotter. Okay, so the advice would be use the passive voice, but use it frugally. Number 3 was about less and fewer, when you should be using the word less, the adjective less, and when you should be using the word fewer. The rule goes like this, that less is for things that are uncountable, so there has been less rain, for example, and fewer for things that are countable, so there are fewer people in the building. Less and fewer. 4, end a sentence with a preposition. So a preposition is one of those small words that tells you the relationship of one thing to another. In, to, from. Okay, so you shouldn't be saying, goes the description, that's the box that I put it in. Instead, you should be turning around the syntax of your sentence and you should be saying, that's the box in which I put it. Difficult. Okay, so end sentences with prepositions, and then finally the famous one of never splitting an infinitive, which will be talked about in a minute. Okay, so here we now have some quotations from some famous authors, some real heavyweights of literature here. So according to today's grammatical rules, how might the following quotations be considered non-standard? He never yet no villainy ne said in all his life unto no man erwicht. A line from the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, so that's the late 14th century. No one can never fill the place that's empty, from Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. She owned that, considering everything, she was not absolutely without inclination for the party. Jane Austen, Emma, early 19th century. I will preserve myself, and am bethought to take the basest and most poorest shape. King Lear. Shakespeare. Well, of all the artful and designing orphans that ever I see, Oliver, you are one of the most barefacest. That's Dickens from Oliver Twist. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. The Tempest by Shakespeare. Right, pause the video there. Those 6 quotations, what seems to be non-standard in terms of today's current grammatical rules about each of them. Okay, let us talk through the answers. Right, first of all, this one from the Canterbury Tales. He never yet no villain ne said in all his life unto no man wicked. He never did anything wrong, nor said anything wrong in his life in any way to anybody. He was a pretty good person then. This is a description of the knight. Now, multiple negation. That's what's going on here. We've got 4 negative adverbs. Never, no, nay, no. Okay. So, the rule goes that if you negate a sentence, if you say something like, I never done nothing, like that, then actually what you are saying is, I have done something. Because by applying the rules of maths and logic, then 2 minuses make a plus. Okay. So the point is that if you look back over literature, there are all sorts of emphatic uses of double, triple, or even quadruple negation, as we've got here. And this is for emphasis sake. The other point to make is that other languages have these double negative forms. If you think of standard French, for example, you've got the ne pas structure in there as well. Okay, so perfectly acceptable form for Geoffrey Chaucer writing in the Canterbury Tales. Similarly with Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, no one can never fill the place that's empty. Oh dear, we've got a double negative in there. So if this was to be written in current standard day English, you might say no one can ever fill the place that's empty. And similarly, have you noticed the pattern that's going on here? So Jane Austen in Emma, she owned that considering everything, she was not absolutely without inclination for the party. So again, you've got a double negative there. You've got the adverb there, and then you've got that word without as well. Okay, and it essentially means that she did want to go to the party. But you could argue, well, Jane Austen has purposefully done that in order to give a bit of an indication into her state of mind, that she hums and haws, she's not quite sure, but on balance, yes, she probably does want to go to the party. So you could say, well, it's a rhetorical technique that's being used here. It's litotes. Litotes is the opposite of hyperbole. If you've got your AQA textbook, there's an explanation for it on the bottom of page 266, as I remember. And litotes means negating a negative. So that's what Jane Austen's doing here. She's negating a negative. Okay, so we've got three examples there of multiple negation going on, which might be considered non-standard for today's grammatical rules. We've got a bit of Shakespeare over here. And look at this bit here, and most poorest shape. Well, when you get an adjective and you bang a suffix on the end, like est, which is the superlative form, then that's usually it in standard English. One doesn't need to put most in front of it because the est suffix is doing the job. So one of those you might say is redundant. Again, you might just say, well, this is for emphasis sake. So Shakespeare wants us to show that, this is not just an extreme form, it's a very, very extreme form, and that's why he's doubled up on those superlative forms. Who's this? Well, this is Fagin, isn't it, from Oliver Twist? Well, of all the artful and designer orphans that I ever see, Oliver, you are one of the most barefacedest. So, by the logic of the last one, it's the same thing, isn't it? Because we've got a double superlative here. And if you were writing in proper standard English, you would say, well, you can't do that. One of those is redundant. Okay, so it would either be the most barefaced or it would be the barefacedest. And then finally, back to Shakespeare. We are such dreams. Get it right. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. Sin of all sins. This is a preposition that's put at the end of the sentence. So according to the grammarians of the 18th century, better not to have a preposition at the end of the sentence. What you're going to have to do is sort of reconstruct the syntax of the sentence. We are such stuff on which dreams are made. Oh yes, that's much better. Okay, so these so-called rules that we have of English actually go back to the 18th century. And here are two heavyweights of the grammar world. We have Bishop Lowth, who produces a very important book in 1762, and we have Lindley Murray, who produces a book in 1795. Now, if you have your AQA textbook, then I encourage you to be reading all about these two characters on pages 210 and 212. Let's talk through some of the nuts and bolts of it. So here he is, Bishop Lowth, and so he's publishing his influential Short Introduction to English Grammar in 1762. And this is influential. It proves important to people. The middle classes lap it up. It starts to be used a little bit in classrooms as well. Lowth is teaching his son, and he's teaching his son Latin. And so his real reason for coming up with these rules is that he thought an understanding of English grammar would actually assist with the proper job in language of learning Latin. And here are some of his so-called rules that he wanted to put forward. He didn't like thou, that second person pronoun, the subject pronoun, the familiar pronoun thou. Didn't like that at all. presumably thought of it as being a kind of dialect form. So he wanted that dismissed from the language. He wanted to differentiate between the modal auxiliary verbs will and shall, and he wanted people to use will if they were issuing a promise or a threat, right? I will give you that £10, and I shall if you're foretelling something. Middlesbrough shall win the championship this year. Yeah, right. So differentiate between personal and impersonal relative pronouns. So you've got the person who is waiting at the bus stop. So it's a person, so therefore it's who. So the book which I'm reading now, that's not a person, so I'm going to use which or that. Okay, and then his fourth rule is differentiate between who and whom as relative pronouns. So to whom it may belong, well, that's good, says Louth, because you're using whom there as the object of the sentence, whereas who am I talking to? That's used as the subject of the sentence. So he's differentiating between who and who. Notice actually how archaic whom has become. It survives in some collocations that we have, like to whom it may belong, but other than that, there are very few people these days, except in quite highly ornate texts, who use whom as the object pronoun. Louth was also saying your prepositions, don't put them at the end of the sentence. No. Put them right before the noun. That's what you need to be doing. That was famously lampooned by Winston Churchill, who said, this is the kind of language up with which I will not put. Like that, which kind of shows the absurdity of tangling yourself in knots in order to follow that rule. Then you've got don't split the infinitive. So this is the idea that the infinitive is the two bits of the verb. You've got the verb, the preposition to, and then you've got the verb. And what he's saying is that you shouldn't put anything between to and the verb, right? And the famous example, of course, is from Star Trek, to boldly go where no man, blah, blah, blah. So that's an example of a split infinitive, because you've got to boldly go. So it's a split infinitive with the adverb boldly splitting between that. And that really comes from the idea that in Latin, of course, which was thought to be the perfect language, you couldn't do it because the infinitive was actually just one single word. So laudare, for example, means to praise, Laudare. That was the single word for it, the infinitive form. And then finally, don't do multiple negation. So, which we've just talked about, things like I never done nothing. Okay. So God knows what he would have made of, the Canterbury Tales and Geoffrey Chaucer doing that. 4 negated adverbs in one line. Those were his rules that he was trying to get people to follow. This is the prescriptive grammars that are coming along in the 18th century. Get it into context. So this is the start, just about at this time, of grammar schools. I mean, that just shows how important grammar was, where the middle classes are beginning to send their children off to school in order to get educated and show that they were different from the plebs who were working in the factories or in the fields. And so it was important not only to dress them up and to give them property that put them aside from the working classes, but to make sure that they were using language which showed their social status. Okay, so here comes Steven Pinker, who's got a view about, asking people not to split an infinitive. He says, forcing modern speakers of English to not to split an infinitive because it isn't done in Latin makes about as much sense as forcing modern residents of England to wear laurels and togas. So he's making an analogy there, saying it's utterly ridiculous to have a rule to stop people splitting infinitives. And if Steven Pinker says it, it must be right. Okay, so there in the textbook there you have some sentences where you have to work out what would be the correct grammatical form of the following sentences. Do you want to have a go at doing this then? You don't have any choice. Here we go. Number 1, we didn't know who or whom was responsible. The first one. Number 2, who or whom did you send the letter to? 3, I buy less or fewer CDs than I used to. Number 4, I had to quickly finish my homework. Number 5, mine was different to everyone else's. And number 6, it was him that won the race. Pause the video there. How would you rearrange these sentences or correct them? Let's go through them. We didn't know who was responsible. Right, so this is where you can tie yourself up in knots thinking, is this the subject or the object pronoun of the sentence? Okay, so who is the standard form according to Louth. So he says, and I'll just read it out from the textbook here, there has been much debate about who or whom should be used. According to the correct rule, who is used in the subject position and whom is used in the object position, or if it follows a preposition. So in this sentence, who is correct. This sentence can be split into two. We don't know and who is responsible. So it would be incorrect to use whom linked to irresponsible. Hope you got that. Number 2, who or whom did you send the letter to? Right, and so whom here would actually be the correct choice because whom there is the object form of the pronoun. So you is the subject. So did you send the letter to whom? So it's got the preposition in front of it and it's the object of the sentence. Okay. I buy less CDs or I buy fewer CDs than I used to. Well, remember how Bishop Louth is differentiating between the two. So less is for things that are uncountable and fewer is for things that are countable. So if CDs, they are damn well countable, aren't they? So in this standard form, Louth's form, fewer would be the right way. I had to quickly finish my homework. What on earth is non-standard about that, you might say? Well, it's a split infinitive because we've got the preposition to, we've got the verb there, and it's being interjected with that, the adverb of manner, quickly. So if you move that to somewhere else in the sentence, Bishop Louth would approve of it. I had to finish quickly my homework, or I had to finish my homework quickly, you might say. The thing about adverbs is that you can shunt them around sentences, and each time you do that, you're slightly changing the meaning because you're foregrounding that in different ways. Right, mine was different to everyone else's. What's wrong with that? Well, according to Louth, it's this preposition here, because if you're saying there's difference between them, you shouldn't be using the preposition to, you should be using the preposition from. So from denotes difference. Okay. And on the final one, it was him that won the race. Well, there are two things in there. It was he, because he is the subject of the sentence. Him as an object form. So it was he, and it wouldn't be that, because it's describing a person. It was he who won the race. Okay, so these are Bishop Louth's kind of rules of grammar, and they were further cemented by another grammarian called Lindley Murray, who came along 3 decades later in 1795, and he published English Grammar. And this was very, 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 very important. It's so important it was printed apparently in 22 editions over 30 years. And so what it did was it built upon Louth's ideas, whereas Louth had suggested that these should be tendencies, Lindley Murray was much more hardline. He set these down as absolute rules that educated people should be following. Okay, so it's a really good example of attempted change from above, not below. These are important people who are laying down the rules that people should be following. And you could argue that this was a pretty successful an attempt, because he is producing these grammar books which are used in the schools, and the school teachers are delivering these to the school students. And so in people's minds, these become the rules, the correct rules of English. So there weren't only grammarians around at the time who were heavily prescriptive. There is Joseph Priestley, for example, who offered a more descriptive approach. And this is what he writes in the preface to his Rudiments of English Grammar from 1761. He says, as to a public academy, I think it not only unsuitable to the genius of a free nation, but in itself ill calculated to reform and fix a language. Right, so he's poo-pooing the idea that Sir Jonathan Swift had in 1712 when he said, let's set up an academy to fix the language. And he doesn't like that idea. He's with Dr. Johnson, who also didn't like the idea of an academy. He says that a free nation shouldn't have an academy that lays down rules like that. And also, he doesn't think that it's an appropriate tool to fix the language. So he doesn't like that. But what he then goes on to say is we need make no doubt but that the best forms of speech will in time establish themselves by their own superior excellence. So what he's saying is that the way that people naturally talk through conversation, they themselves will fix the language. They will be the best, most efficient form of using communication. So that's quite different to Murray and Louth with their prescriptive attempts to kind of fix the language. Okay, so the point is that in this 18th and 19th century, you get this rise in grammatical attention. And what this leads to is changes in written style. Most of you will have read 19th century texts. You'll have read them for your English language GCSE and maybe in literature as well. And when you're reading it, you may feel a little bit frustrated because you might think, this is really elaborate. You know, does Dickens need to be using language in such an elaborate way? You might feel, oh, it's overly rhetorical and maybe it feels a little bit pompous. But this was very much the kind of discourse of the time. And it was because correct usage of so-called good grammar, i.e., you know, the grammar of people like Louth and Murray, and it became associated with social status. So you get Punch magazine cartoons like this, where a gentleman tips his hat and says, I beg your pardon, ma'am, but I think you dropped this. So it's the idea that their horror of horrors, this middle-class lady in her big skirt here, has actually dropped her H's. So she's saying horse instead of horse and at instead of hat, and therefore is betraying her lowly social status. Okay, so this is a tremendous concern amongst people in the 18th century. And of course, you've got to put it in the context of the Industrial Revolution, where you've got a kind of working class people pouring into the towns and the cities. And so the middle classes are trying to differentiate themselves through their language from the working classes. Okay, so there is this full attention about grammar. If you look in the AQA textbook on page 213, in there, you've got an excerpt from a grammar book, and it's quite interesting because it gives you an indication of kind of how grammar might have been taught in these Victorian times. I don't know whether this is going to let me into this. So let me just read a page of this to give you a flavour of how grammar was taught in some Victorian schools. It's quite amusing the way it's done. Let's see if I can see this. Right, okay, let's go here. Let's shorten that. Right, so here we go. Chapter 1, Mr. Noun. The first part of speech, that was called Mr. Noun. He's a stout, big fellow, very well dressed, for he doesn't mind showing that he's very rich. As Mr. Noun came forward, Sergeant Parsing rose, put his pen behind his ear, arranged his papers on the table before him, and looked at Mr. Noun through his eyeglass, asked, What is your name? Name, answered Mr. Noun. Yes, your name, replied Sergeant Parsing. Name, again answered Mr. Noun. Do not trifle, sir, said the judge sternly. What is your name? Answer at once and truly. I have answered truly, replied Mr. Noun. My name is Noun. For noun means name. The name of everything belongs to me, so I am called Mr. Name, or Mr. Noun, which means the same thing, and all my words are called nouns. The name of everything belongs to you? Asked Sergeant Parsing in surprise. Yes, answered Mr. Noun, the name of everything. What? Do you mean to say that the name of everything I can see round now is one of your words and is called a noun? I do indeed, said Mr. Noun. The name of everything you can see or touch or taste or smell or hear belongs to me. What? Said Sergeant Parsing. Is this desk yours then? The ink and the pen and the window? The words that name them all are mine, said Mr. Noun. Of course, I have nothing to do with things. No gentleman in Grammarland has anything to do with things, only with words. And I assure you, you cannot name anything that you cannot see or touch or taste or smell or hear without using one of my words. Desk, pen, ink, window, water, wine, fire, smoke, light, lightning, thunder, a taste, a smell, a noise. All these words belong to me and are called nouns. I see, said Sergeant Posey. And you can hear thunder and smell smoke and taste wine, and I suppose dinner and tea are all yours. Certainly the words breakfast, dinner and tea are mine, replied Mr. Noun. Right, I will stop there. It's exhausting to read, isn't that? So you might want to deconstruct that and have a think about, how skillfully the language is being used. We often think of kind of Victorian grammar books as being very kind of fussy and boring to read, laying down these prescriptive rules. But you can see here in this 19th century grammar book that actually there are lots of attempts by the writer to make grammar interesting. Okay, interesting and memorable, not least because of the personalization that we've got here. So we've got abstract ideas which are being presented as if they're real people in order to entertain in a kind of humorous narrative. Okay, so I'm going to stop you there. Thank you very much. And in our next lesson, we'll try and have a think about sort of current day attitudes towards grammatical